My name is Leanne G. Bowley. I am the Director of Programming here at Village Preservation, and I'm very thrilled to welcome you today. We want to tell you just a little bit about Village Preservation before we get started. Since 1980, we've been fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We do that in a number of ways, including documenting and celebrating the neighborhoods with free programming. We work to extend landmark and zoning protections. We do a bunch of advocacy. So hopefully you will join us in one of these ventures as well as our free programming like tonight. And we're very proud to bring you this and many programs for free throughout the year. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement means the world to us. I'm going to put our website one more time in the chat so you can check us out there. A little bit of Zoom protocol. There is on the bottom of your screen typically ability to chat, ability to move things around if you need to, and also to open up any number of different kinds of apps that you might be able to use. Though, as I mentioned, we're muted, you can definitely put things into the chat and we will have those questions for our wonderful esteemed author today at the end of our session. So please put those in as you go. You don't have to wait till the end, put them in as we go. And I will disappear for a little bit while Glenna is doing our presentation, but then I will reappear and we'll do some Q&A. But I'm delighted to introduce Glenna Lang today with us, who is the author. You might know her from her previous book, The Genius of Common Sense, The Story of Jane Jacobs and the Death and Life of Great American Cities. Both the New York Times and Smithsonian Magazine chose it in 2009 as a notable book. So this is a great follow-up to the book that we'll be discussing today, Jane Jacobs' First City. As an illustrator, Lang produced 4 classic poems and picture books for children with David R. Godin, publisher, and she wrote illustrated Looking Out for Sarah, about a day in the life of a seeing eye dog, which won the American Library Association's Schneider Family Award for the book that best portrays the disability experience. And I think that's something we all maybe should pick up and take a look at too, because that's something we all should be caring about as well. Although she grew up mainly in the Jackson Heights neighborhood of Queens, which is where I am, in New York City, she has lived for many years in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're so glad she can join us via Zoom, and teaches at the school of the Museum of Fine Arts, and is now part of Tufts University. She has loved spending time in Scranton in her quest to understand the place and period that spawned Jane Jacobs' world-changing books. And today we're going to be discussing Jane Jacobs' First City, which is a journey through Jane's first 18 years growing up in Scranton. So with that, it's always awkward to hear yourself talked about, right, for many minutes on screen. But with that, I'd like to turn it over to Glenna and take us through this amazing book. We will put the purchase link in the chat, as well as some information you can find out about the book, as well as a discount we'll talk about later, but stay to the end for that. So Glenna, take it away. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Leanne, for such a nice introduction. And it's wonderful to be here with this terrific organization, and also to be speaking with people who actually know about Jane Jacobs to some extent, which is more than I could say in Scranton. So I would like to give you a visual introduction to Scranton as well. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that, oops, here we go. So that you can see what Scranton looks like as well, and not just have to imagine it in your head. You may know Jane through the terms that she coined that are now part of the common parlance. Such ideas as mixed uses, eyes on the street, the sidewalk ballet, citizen participation, and the need for short blocks, density, incremental growth, and all types of diversity are but some of the many concepts that Jane articulated in her now very famous book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Greenwich Village and the city of New York have celebrated Jane by naming the block where she lived for many years in her honor, and I'm thrilled that they have done this. Although Jane adopted New York soon after she finished high school and peppered her groundbreaking book with examples from Greenwich Village, she owed much to her hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania. As revealed in my new book, Jane's ideas germinated in Scranton, where she was born and spent her first 18 years. Since you may know little about Scranton, especially in the early 20th century when she was growing up, I'd like to introduce you to Jane's Scranton. And that's Jane sitting in front of her house. Throughout her life, Jane was passionately interested in history, including the history of her own city, as she called it, and its phenomenally rapid development. At what was known as Slocum Hollow in northeastern Pennsylvania, where the lazy Lackawanna River meets the roaring brook, only 5 houses, a grist mill, and a few other small structures stood. In 1840, several entrepreneurs arrived from the East with new ideas and cutting-edge technology. They planned to construct an enormous iron forge and manufacture pig iron and nails using local iron, limestone, and coal. The ultimately successful iron manufacturing enterprise created more demand for coal from the surrounding valley. Coal was plentiful and it was most profitable. Railroads and other supporting industries proliferated. In less than 20 years, Scranton, named for 2 of its founding entrepreneurs, became a thriving town. By 1856, Scranton's downtown had fine houses, churches, and a hotel arranged within this planned grid. It included alleys, which were later classied up with the name courts, that bisected large blocks and resulted in short blocks as well. Jane experienced long and short blocks from early childhood and would later advocate for them in her writing. This well-designed grid established the pattern for the town's future booming development. A steady influx of newcomers seeking opportunities arrived from other US regions and foreign countries. With a burgeoning population in 1866, only a quarter century after the construction of the first iron furnace, Scranton officially incorporated as a city. In 1914, Scranton journalist and cartoonist Bill Steinke celebrated the profusion and diversity of industry in Scranton in his sketch. Such a variety and range of businesses, Jane would conclude in her book, Economy of Cities, was of utmost importance to the economic well-being of a city. This postcard of downtown Scranton around 1906 shows its continued meteoric rise, replete with magnificent architecture, institutions, libraries, theaters, a museum, and excellent schools. This was the lively, splendid, promising city Jane's parents chose to settle in and start a business and a family. Jane was born Jane Butzner on May 4th, 1916, when Scranton was the booming anthracite coal capital of the world and a major manufacturing center. Here is Scranton's downtown in 1916, before hard times started with a number of devastating coal miners' strikes. Then the Great Depression took its toll. Neither of Jane's parents had any connection to Scranton before they moved to what was then believe it or not, Pennsylvania's third most populous city, surpassed only by Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Her father, John Decker Butzner, grew up on his parents' modest farm in rural Virginia. A rich uncle recognized Decker's scholarly abilities and saw to it that he received a top-notch college education. Decker studied medicine at the prominent University of Virginia and became a medical doctor in 1905. At a Philadelphia hospital, he met his future wife, the supervising night nurse, Bess Robison. From a village outside Bloomsburg, 60 miles southwest of Scranton, Bess grew up in a stately brick house with 8 siblings. Bess's father was a well-respected lawyer, and her mother had been a school teacher. Despite their country roots, Dr. and Mrs. Butzner wanted to live in a city. They deliberated long and hard as to what city would hold the most promise for a successful medical practice and raising children. Rejecting the runner-up Detroit, the Butzners decided on the prosperous city of Scranton with its 130,000 residents and a thriving economy. This decision would perplex Jane her entire life. We're thinking of Scranton since then. In 1909, the couple married and made Scranton their home. After losing their 2.5-year-old son to a childhood disease, Decker, as he was called, and Bess and their 6-year-old daughter, Betty, were especially thrilled at the arrival of a new baby, Jane Isabel Butzner, pictured here in her mother's arms. Within a few years, the family would welcome 2 more little boys, John and Jimmy. The Butzners bought this newly built house on Electric Street, where Jane was born, in the Greenwich neighborhood, from a man down the block who worked as a mason and carpenter. He built this single dwelling as a business venture, a common way for individuals with construction skills to earn a living. Greenwich was an emerging streetcar suburb of the city, its growth stimulated by transportation extending into sparsely populated land within the city limits. The incremental growth of numerous small projects like this one made for variation among the size, design, and ornamentation of houses along the street and attracted a mix of people in different occupations with a range of incomes. Even in her toddler years, Jane observed and experienced the sidewalk in front of her family's home, made of slate commonly found alongside anthracite deposits. This photo captures Jane and her brother John and some toy vehicles they could ride. Jane reminisced about the vehicles that her mother called velocipedes. In her later years, she recalled her annoyance when the vehicle's wheels got stuck in the cracks. Every time you hit a joint in the slate sidewalk, she said, you had to pick it up and move it to the next slate. At the end of their long block, the Butzners encountered a cluster of stores. Nearby were industrial buildings such as this plaster factory. In the walkable distance, coal breakers loomed like giant praying mantises. George Sanderson, who blazed the trail into Greenwich and subdivided the land into plots on the grid, did not mind erecting his own lovely house there amidst industry, not far from factories and businesses, schools and churches. At the same time, he donated land for the common good, such as libraries and schools. What Jane observed and would later call mixed uses occurred organically in Scranton. When Jane was not quite 5, the Butzners had outgrown their compact home. The parents and their 4 young children moved to a larger house less than a mile away in the neighboring borough of Dunmore. They bought this house on Monroe Avenue from George Yinke in 1921. Yinke was a German immigrant and self-employed contractor who appears to have designed and built this fine house himself. Neighbors had also emigrated from various countries, including Sweden, Austria, Belgium, and Ireland. Nearer the Electric Street end, where the streetcar ran, houses were smaller and more affordable to lower income folks. People of Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish faiths resided in close proximity on this block and throughout the Scranton area. Jane appreciated these many kinds of diversity. Like all the city's neighborhoods, the Butzner section of Dunmore had many small businesses in easy walking distance, such as a greenhouse and florist shop, several small groceries and drugstores, at least one of which had a soda fountain, and a barber. By building a small addition with a large window, people converted part of their home to mom and pop businesses found mainly at corners and along the busier streets. Others, like the potato chip and peanut butter factory with its little sales window, were located in the backyards or the alleys. Jane attended Dunmore's George Washington No. 3 Grammar School in this beautifully designed building. Because students, teachers, and the principal all lived nearby, everyone walked no more than 20 minutes to school. Scranton and Dunmore had truly neighborhood schools. When the school board hired teachers, they usually assigned them to the school nearest where they lived. One of Jane's teachers literally lived next door to the school. Its principal lived 2 doors down from the Butzners. Furthermore, they all walked to school twice a day because they went home for lunch. Even as a very young child, Jane told an interview, "I was so interested in the downtown that I liked it when I had a dental appointment. And believe me, it was not painless dentistry in those days, but I liked it because I could go downtown." For 8th grade, Jane's parents paid a small tuition to enroll her in Scranton's George Washington School No. 1, thus positioning her to go to Scranton's Central High School the following year. This remarkable Gothic Revival building in downtown also housed the city's school administration. Jane, to her delight, could take the streetcar to school and explore the central city during lunchtime with 3 other tuition students who also lived too far to walk home. On their lunchtime explorations, the 4 schoolmates saw architectural treasures still standing when Jane was an 8th grader in the late 1920s, and the lower one is still standing today. In that era of the 1920s, Scranton had many impressive edifices, old and new. Architects were often hired from New York or were locals educated at top architecture schools like Cornell or Columbia. On the same street as their school, the girls admired the old post office building in the 1890s in the upper left here. Across the street, surrounded by open space, stood the glorious 1884 eclectic Lackawanna County Courthouse, designed by the state architect of New York. After second grade, in school, preferred to read books in her lap rather than listen to her teachers or study for tests. Girl Scouts, however, served as a welcome respite from the constraints of school, nurturing her interest and reinforcing her sense of a woman's boundless possibilities. From the time she was 10 and beyond high school, Scouts were a treasured part of her life. She attended weekly meetings after school, spent summers at Girl Scouts Camp Archibald, and eventually was among a select few who attained the highest rank of eaglet, as did her sister Betty. Jane admired the Scouts' practice of democratic self-governance. Girl Scouts encouraged her passion for writing through poetry contests and the excellent editors of their high-quality American Girl magazine. Scouts also nurtured her skills of observation, self-direction, and leadership. Scranton's high school-aged children could attend either Scranton Central High School or its equally excellent Technical High School. As a college-bound student, Jane chose Central. Those pursuing a trade or intending to enter business chose to go to Tech. Both schools had economically and ethnically diverse student bodies, and both had well-trained and committed teachers. Graduates from each school recalled teachers and administrators who went out of their way to tutor recent immigrants and supervise extracurricular activities. Jane participated in drama club and acted in highly acclaimed productions. She was also enthusiastic about the writing club and became poetry editor of Central's impressive student magazine. A fortunate discovery for me was the importance of the African American community in early 20th century Scranton, a small and cohesive population that resided mainly in the neighborhood between Central and Tech high schools. Shown here are neighborhood kids at the Progressive Community Center and at a birthday party. Through her schools, Girl Scouts, and chance encounters in everyday life, Jane, her siblings, and other Scrantonians naturally intermingled with African Americans. There were African American doctors, dentists, and business people who worked with, and get this, employed whites. After high school, Jane's friend Betty Totley, an African American who worked on the school magazine with Jane, and Jane's brother John took part in a youth forum that discussed challenges facing African American youth looking for jobs in the city. And this is when we're already in the Depression. Undoubtedly, Jane attended the forum. John would become a prominent civil rights judge appointed by Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. We now understand that Jane's concern about this issue began in Scranton. Contrary to her parents' wishes, Jane decided not to go to college. After high school, she bartered her writing and observation talents for an unpaid internship at the morning newspaper with the women's page editor. The importance of Jane's internship cannot be overestimated. She honed her writing skills here and studied her city. As you can see in this all-male newsroom, she was one of the few females, but she earned the respect of the male reporters. Within a few months, the editors assigned Jane the responsibility for reviewing plays and books, and soon news articles, gaining insights into the politics, institutions, and workings of the city. Jane cut her journalistic teeth here. She valued the press's commitment to reporting impartially all that was going on. In her time, newspapers served as the city's primary means of communication, with morning and evening daily papers and special editions for important breaking news. Weeklies focused on smaller communities or were printed in foreign languages. The city's papers reported on everything from municipal elections to children's piano recitals. Upon her departure, the editors praised Jane's work on their op-ed page. Jane arrived in New York in 1934 and moved in with her sister Betty in Brooklyn Heights. This was a long planned next step in Jane's determination to become a writer. When Jane discovered the village, she announced to Betty, "I found out where we have to live." They rented an apartment here at 55 Morton Street in this small-scale, close-knit, multicultural, and industrial diverse neighborhood that in some ways resemble their hometown. After Jane married architect Bob Jacobs in 1944, pictured here with their son Jimmy, they bought and fixed up this former candy store at 555 Hudson Street in the West Village. While living in this home, Jane observed from her window, walked and biked New York streets, and wrote Death and Life of Great American Cities. Jane's political activism began in New York when she was moved to help Scranton through the power of her written pleas. In the 1950s and 60s, when she learned that Greenwich Village was threatened by urban renewal and impending highways, she couldn't help but join in the protests and quickly became a leader, landing in jail on occasion. In 1968, she and her family emigrated to her final city of Toronto so that her sons could avoid being drafted into the Vietnam War. At the end of her long life, Jane's thoughts often turned to her home city. It was a livable and manageable medium-sized city that had bred tolerance and a sense of civic purpose among its diverse population. And that's my visual presentation for you. I very much look forward to your asking any and all questions that occur to you about either Scranton or her earlier life in New York or later in Toronto. Thank you.
That was fascinating. I hope everyone was as enthralled as I was and learned so many new things about someone I know I've long loved, but so many new things to find out. One question that came up while you were going through, Glenna, what was the paper that Jane first worked at? Which newspaper was that?
It was called the Scranton Republican. The other one was called the Scranton Times. Eventually they merged, but it meant that when there was a local election, they would often endorse Republican candidates, but it really did not affect their reporting of the news. And the Times was actually, that was the afternoon paper, and it was actually the larger of the two, but the Scranton Republican was a very, very renowned paper. And to some extent, both newspapers still exist today, which is pretty amazing. In print, no less.
Wow, that is very impressive. Was it 60 Minutes? I just was watching something about newspapers this week and how tough it is to stay in print. So that is very impressive. I don't know if we can point to Jane's tenure there as part of the reason, but definitely very cool.
No, it shows how much Scrantonians valued the newspapers.
Yeah, which we had talked before. I think it's so fascinating since, Scranton's probably going to come up more and more now with our current president and his birthplace. Could you talk a little bit about the gaps in your research and not in your research, but how with your research you had to fill so many gaps because records were either destroyed or not maintained, or how did you kind of piece everything together so well to have such a comprehensive book?
Oh, well, that was fun. And it was also, it explains why I spent at least 10 years doing this, plus the time prior to this for the previous book. But I was really lucky because when I started, I was able to take oral histories to interview people who had known Jane. She hadn't been gone that long, but her classmate was alive and very mentally competent and had an incredible memory. So I learned a ton from her about her very earliest years in grammar school. They knew each other all through high school, and this woman kept up with her family once Jane left. But I literally was looking in closets in some of the old schools, the old grammar schools and the school administration building. Finding old receipts gave you certain information. Walking the city tells you a lot. They have a wonderful library there where they do collect as much local history as possible. And there's the Architectural Heritage Association, which got active in the 1980s to save old buildings, which were being torn down right and left. And this Preservation Society has preserved some of the records. It's, the records are spotty, but a lot of things could be filled in through census records and, government documents, life and death, birth and death records. You look everywhere. It has a wonderful anthracite museum and a wonderful natural history and art museum. They're just scraps everywhere if you look hard enough. So it's kind of like a treasure hunt, or like being a detective, and you found these little teeny pieces that came together. And I have to credit somebody else who's really important there, and she is the caretaker of the, I believe, oldest existing cemetery in Scranton, and it has 18,000 residents. The caretaker's name is Norma Reese, and she personally has been for many years researching the lives of what she calls her residents. So little people's efforts like that really are just a gold mine for researchers.
I think that's so fascinating. And as a preservation organization, to hear like the places that were so important for you to think about, and then also thinking about our membership, how we all have a part to play. Like what is the little part of our community that we are responsible for preserving and sharing and holding on to. I think also the mention of the library, as a kid who grew up and spending all my time in the local library in a small town, I think that really speaks to the importance of cultural institutions like libraries and museums in this work too. So interesting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And records of businesses, the Chamber of Commerce. I can't possibly list all the sources, but all those institutions, and keeping records that you may not think are important, is really important. The schools had some records during Jane's years of attendance books, what classes the students took. These were in the current high school's library. They're sort of on a back shelf. A wonderful librarian told me about them, and they had the school magazines there. So, don't throw that stuff out, please.
I think those are good reminders for us as we, we can digitize so much, but there is something also, I think, to having records and having the space for those things. And we have a couple of questions that have already come in. So keep the questions coming, and I'll keep asking your questions instead of my own. I can get those answered another time. Karen asks, what brought Jane's sister to New York, and what was Jane's first job in New York? So moving from Scranton, we have some Scranton questions too, but this is one about New York.
Her sister was artistic and very interested in textiles, and she'd gone to art school for a while in Philadelphia. And she came to work for, I'm going to get this right, Dorothy Draper Textiles in New York. And Jane's, and Betty was 6 years older than Jane. So, she was considerably older for that whatever period in their lives. And they were very close. And Jane came, and she had actually, in between the high school and her internship at the paper, she'd actually taken, at her parents' insistence, stenography and typing classes. So she looked for work as a secretary in various businesses, and she went through a succession of that sort of clerical work while she was writing articles, walking around New York, writing articles to submit to various magazines. So, gosh, I can't remember all of them. Some were trade. She landed an article. I think one of her first was for the New York Herald Tribune, a freelance article. And so the year after she got to New York. So she freelanced, so gained experience, and then eventually got, I think her first big job was at Iron Age magazine, which was an industry magazine for that. And she became an editor there.
How interesting. I was just watching a Kurt Vonnegut, very different person, but documentary, and he started in an industrial kind of job too for GE. So it's so interesting, these people who we don't think of like as industry folks necessarily getting kind of some of their first gigs in business.
But it's a talent. She was able to write what I would call very interesting articles for the industry. She also eventually used it as her pulpit to bring attention to Scranton's need for wartime industry. It was practically a ghost town at that point in the early 40s. And she was successful. She teamed up with her old buddies at the Scranton Republican. So she used it for a very good purpose. So that was her first civic activism, I would say.
That's so brilliant. And I love that, to tie that thread with the hometown. Like, she didn't have to come to New York to know activism. She was involved from where she kind of started.
Exactly.
That's great. Well, we have some other great questions. Helen or Helene, I'm sorry if I got it wrong. Are there any recorded interviews of Jane Jacobs? I don't know if they mean audio or video. And then are there archives of her papers at the New York Public Library or National Archive, or where do those papers live?
There are tons of interviews with her because she became very beloved after she wrote her book. I believe that Village Preservation has a bunch of interviews. as well. And my goodness, if you Google her name, you can find interviews online. Toronto loved Jane as much as New York did in some ways, and or maybe even more. And there are videos made in Toronto. You can get a very wonderful sense of her. And archive. Well, surprisingly, her archives are in Boston at Boston College. And she was very interested in their work in ethics and had gone there a number of times when she was writing a book about ethics called Systems of Survival. And I guess they talked to her at the right time, and they said to her, "Where do you think you might leave your papers?" And she didn't have to think long. She said, "Well, I think this would be a very good place." So you would think they'd be at the New York Public Library, but the sort of a smaller archives like the Boston College Burns Library is actually a great place to read all her papers.
Incredible. And also we're lucky, my colleague Hugh, they put in the chat that we actually have an oral history interview with Jane on our website as well. So that's a good starting place. You have a place to go if you want to hear Jane, and then you can dive into all these amazing resources. It's nice when someone so wonderful is so well loved and her things are taken care of. So I think this is a great example. And on that note, you've kind of spoken to this already, but what other things would you say as preservationists, what should we be paying attention to when we're hearing, something might be going away or something might be moving? What are the things we should cling to, Glenna, so that researchers like you in the future have a wealth of information to go to? You did kind of speak about this, but maybe a few more details.
Yeah, well, I guess I overlooked mentioning an incredible source of information, which is the historic newspapers. And I hate to see our newspapers go under, partly for that reason. And especially in a time like the 20s and 30s and even earlier, when the newspapers reported so much, I guess you would call it social news, people going out of town. You're able to follow the lives of what we'll call regular people, not just famous people, but how do you learn about the average or, working class person? It's there. If you preserve school records, it will be there. Some preserving records in unusual places that shed light on everyday life, not just historic events or political events. I think that's really important and so fascinating, because it helps to understand someone like Jane Jacobs when, in her most formative years, when you can go back and understand the milieu that she was coming from and find out, as I was able to, who her classmates were, And it's great that there are so many interviews with her, because then you hear her in her own words, which is wonderful.
Yes, and I think it's so. We were also talking beforehand about how the diversity of Scranton. She didn't have to wait to come to New York to understand that there's all different kinds of people, and that the built environment affects all different kinds of people, and at the same time, although there's diversity, there's unity in that too, in where they grew up. So I think that's very beautiful, and to think about those things so we get an accurate picture of our history and not the presumptions one might have. Like I said, as a New Yorker, thinking, oh, Pennsylvania, that's going to be less diverse. We get the reality of what the snapshot was there. Doreen asks, speaking of which, Doreen asks, how does the diversity of Scranton of her youth compare with the Scranton of today, if you have any of that information?
It's continued quite a bit. It still has a large immigrant population. And I have to credit Scranton's geography a little bit, because Scranton is a city that's kind of located in the bottom of a large bowl, and it I don't want to say forces, but it allows people to be close together. So it's a sort of flat bottom where the river and the brook meet, and then quite steep hills around a lot of it, so that everyone has to live cheek by jowl, which they do in New York to some extent. And I think Scranton's size allowed for, not being too big, allowed for a feeling of being connected to the city government, being connected to your neighbors, and the neighborhoods being connected to one another. And it's a nice formula. But New York is
That's why I love that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
That's why I love that cartoon that you have in the book with all the different industries. And it just, to me, showed like, oh, there's so much vitality going on just in the representation of industry.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And I was thrilled when I found that, in a book from 1914 that was in the library. And it was just perfect. Because it also is the basis of what Jane felt was a strong economy, a strong fabric of population. All that diversity was just key to everything, and it's fun. Yeah,
and that makes me wonder. We have a couple other questions, but I have a question for you about your process. Describe kind of that process of deciding on what pictures go in and illustrations and what that's like. You kind of talked about the scavenger huntness of looking through the data. The images are so great. So I'm wondering a little bit about that process and what that's like.
Oh, well, finding images was a task unto itself, because once again, you're looking for pictures of sort of mundane things. It was hard to find pictures of coal miners, for example, in those particular years. But so I don't know, the problem in the end, not with the photos, but with the text, is there was so much, and I always joke about, well, a lot of it ended up on the cutting room floor. There was so much, and how do you make it into a readable text so that you don't overwhelm people, but you paint a picture. And being an artist myself, I felt that the book had to have lots of visuals, the ones that I could find, and that was very much a way to tell part of the story or the whole story. So
were you tempted to illustrate things you couldn't find in the photos?
I did that in Genius of Common Sense, but this, I wanted to be an adult book. If you start drawing your own pictures, it becomes a children's book somehow, even if it is 400 pages. Yeah, I forgot where I was going with that.
Oh, we were just talking about finding the photos and the cutting room floor, how there was just so much, It was such a rich amount of information.
Well, once again, especially with the African-American neighborhood, I found a wonderful, unbelievable person to interview. And she's quoted a lot in the book, Dorothy Walker Smith. And she also had a collection of photographs, and some were historic, and I owe her for that. So finding people who had family photos who were usually more than happy to share them was also a treat. So, I ended up making very wonderful friends in Scranton. And then they were kind enough to let me use some of their photographs and to look for them to begin with, which is quite a chore. That's so lovely. And it kind of brings us to Eric's question here. And I'm going to read it verbatim. Very briefly, what accounts for Scranton's decline from 150,000 to 75,000
Many mid-sized cities suffer from the same form of depopulation and struggle to offer basic elements of community cohesion, yet Scranton is, in your account, still a lively place. What accounts for this vitality? So feel free to attack that at any angle. We're not asking you to be an expert in cities, but
yeah. The first part of the question is, how did it decline so much? And because the economy declined, it had become too dependent on coal, and when coal was partly mined out and partly as people switched fuels, I mean, the bottom kind of fell out of their economy, and people left. And there's a high school teacher in the book who says Scranton's main biggest export at this point, and that was end of 1940s, is its young people, because they didn't want to stay around. There was no work. And I think now, as maybe, there's less of that sense of community in larger cities, and there is more work with new industries. Education, eds and meds is becoming a big part of the economy now. Some people are moving back to Scranton after having been away, or the families having been away. I don't want to go on too long, but they're coming from, Republic of Congo, all sorts of places, and enjoying the same kind of atmosphere, a welcoming atmosphere that Scranton always had. I hope that
they should get you on a tourism campaign, Glenna.
Well, we don't want to tell too many people, because we want development to go slowly. That's
always the tough thing. Jackson Heights, where I live and where you're from, experiencing the same thing. It's the best kept secret, but how do we keep it wonderful as we share the secret?
Well, Jane felt that incremental growth and also continuity of people. If too many people leave at once, it's terrible. There should be a natural inflow, and people die off and all that sort of thing. But you need to replenish it. And old buildings are important. You need cheaper places for people to live too. So I'm sure you talk about
so much residence. Yeah, we have two other questions from folks, and then I would love to dive into that if we still have some time. So the two questions are, what drew you to this project and this part of Jane's life? And then on the back end, when Jane went to Toronto, did she ever come back to Greenwich Village? Was there any kind of back and forth, or was she squarely in Toronto? And then also, what drew you to this kind of research in this part of her life?
What drew me was doing the first book, and there was very little information anywhere about her early years in Scranton. So I decided I would go to Scranton and see what it looked like. And when I did, I was really taken with what was left of its beautiful architecture, its size, the feeling I got from walking around and what Jane must have seen. So the trip to Scranton was influential. And then because of that first book, an architect learned, most people in Scranton had no idea who Jane Jacobs was. And this architect asked me to come and talk about Jane Jacobs to mainly architects, but other people in the city as well. And I did more research for that. And the more I learned, I said, I get it now. I understand that she had lived death and life in many ways in her early years. So, and the second part of the question was...
I lobbed two at you at the same time. So Toronto, did she come back to Greenwich Village after moving to Toronto, or was that kind of...
I mean, she became a Canadian citizen. She was very much ensconced in issues and politics there. The mayors sought her advice. They really, really loved her. They so much appreciated her. I know that she came back for little trips now and then, especially for lectures. so she didn't purposely sever her connection, but she became a citizen of Toronto, and I think enjoyed being a Canadian.
Yeah, and it's so civically minded, being in one place maybe was a good thing. How can you go that deep if you're spread so thin?
Yeah, I should add one little interesting detail, but the book on morals that she wrote, she dedicated to her 3 hometowns. So, and actually addresses of the places where she lived in the 3 hometowns. So it was her Scranton address, 555 Hudson Street, and her Toronto address. So that shows that she was, that all 3 places meant something to her. A lot to her.
That's fascinating. That is, I think that let's talk a little bit more about her advocacy, and especially around development and things, and how place played a part in that. Like, I think when we think about place-based development, we think of her so often, or the struggle to make it equitable and livable. Are there any pieces of advice you had mentioned, like, we need older buildings, we need people to leave not all at once? Are there any other kind of, I hate to say tips because it's so much deeper than a tip, but any other like learnings or lessons that we could hear briefly about place and her thoughts about?
Oh, I mean, and community is so important. I think, from the small group to the larger group, and the interactions between those groups, and that small is beautiful, but we need big government as well to coordinate certain things.
That's great. And
huge question.
Yeah, it is a huge question, and I'm trying to think of more specifically. Like, I know the Robert Moses stuff came up recently with some colleagues of mine. Is there anything from that era that might be super relevant or something that comes to mind?
Well, there's a lot of things you do not want to do, like run highways through beautiful old squares or down a beautiful street like Broome Street, which is what they were planning on doing. A lot of don'ts. And her second big activism in Scranton was when they were considering basically dynamiting the very middle, the crossroads of Scranton, the epicenter of downtown. And she wrote them an impassioned letter and various things, but she couldn't stop it. And the Preservation Society couldn't stop it either. So, I mean, those are kind of unfortunate lessons to be told, and so they're do's and their don'ts.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. I was just talking to someone. There's a building that my community board is trying to save here in Elmhurst of a survivor, someone who left Poland during the Holocaust and helped people come over. And I was saying, we have to try. We have to try to save it, even if it doesn't. If we don't try, it's definitely going to go away. And I think that story about Scranton and how she tried and how that learning she eventually succeeded in so many ways. I think it's important to hear about the things that didn't work too, because it gives us hope. She didn't have a perfect record either for saving everything she went after, I'm sure.
No, she tried to choose causes she thought she could actually win, but she didn't win in Scranton with that one, which took place in the early 90s. And I failed to mention the reason that the city was tearing down this epicenter was they wanted to put up a suburban type mall in its place with a bricked up front and parking in the back, and it wasn't a success. It ended up causing the closing of the 2 main department stores, and not good. The repercussions are not good.
Well, and that's why I think it's important. This is one of the reasons I came to village preservation right now, is that there's a lot of money coming into New York State and New York City in the coming years. And so I think these lessons are very important, because with that, that's great. We can do so many things for the city, but there might be development that comes faster, that, you know, and speeds up. So having these lessons is really important, I think.
Well, that she wrote about in Death and Life, and she called it cataclysmic money, which is a very not good idea, put it that way. Too much money.
Yes. Yeah, so I think that's anyone who's thinking about Jane Jacobs is a fan of Jane Jacobs. I mean, I think now is an important time to be thinking about those things, because we're facing it could be exciting, but also cataclysmic, as she said. Anything else that kind of resonates right now? And we said before how saying right now, it's a heavy sentence to say right now, but any learnings, especially from the Scranton time, that really resonate with you, like this week in particular?
This particular week, my goodness. But I mean, what's so amazing to me is I keep a Google alert for Jane Jacobs, and it's amazing how many alerts I get where she's just mentioned in passing as backup, you know, why we shouldn't do things, why density is important, you know, why preserving old buildings is important, why mixed uses, citizen participation, you know, everything that she advocated in this book is really invoked quite frequently. It's amazing. So if you haven't already, read Death and Life, and if you don't have the time for that, because it's very dense and wonderful. But Genius of Common Sense is kind of a nice introduction to Jane and her basic principles. It was written for young adults, but is read by many older people too.
Yeah, and what a great way to introduce these concepts to young adults and reading it along. This might be my book club with my goddaughter in the coming year, who's very civically minded. What better way to tell a story through illustration and writing and the genius of Jane Jacobs. Go ahead.
It's ultimately an empowering book for young people and less young people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all of us could be empowered a little bit more right now, I think. So any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us about the book, the experience of writing the book, and then we'll wrap up?
I hope that you will find the new book I hope it will resonate with everybody, because we have either parents or grandparents who grew up in those times. I think that what Jane experienced was very common, especially in medium-sized cities and old industrial cities that a lot of us will have a connection through that way. And it's becoming important because that connection with the history of the first third or half of the 20th century that connection is disappearing. And I hope to capture some of that and the book is more about that time as well than it is just about Jane Jacobs. It's a dual portrait of both Jane and the kind of medium-sized industrial city that she grew up in.
Well, and that's what I really enjoyed while I was reading the book, was that I felt like I got a whole picture of where she was. It was great to learn more about her, but just a whole picture of where she was coming from. I feel like it was like family story time almost, like going back and sitting with your grandparents and hearing the story of kind of your family. That's what the book felt like to me, is very like a wonderful story time with our elders sort of thing.
Oh, I'm very gratified to hear that. Thank you. That's terrific.
So on that note, I'm going to share one more time how you can access the book. So because you attended, you can get very graciously, thank you, this 25% discount, Jane25, when you go to the NYU Press. We've shared this link a few times. We'll share it one more time. There's the book there. So I encourage you to pick it up. It's a great read, and I'm grateful that I got to take a look. And then also we will have coming up, one of our events coming up is an evening with playwright Barbara Kahn and friends. It's going to be exciting. There's going to be a performance as well. So hopefully entice you to register for that on March 10th. And also the final thing is, speaking of Jane Jacobs and celebrating our places, we have the Village Awards coming up, and we have nominations. Anyone from anywhere can nominate your favorite place, people, restoration project, business, organization in the village, NoHo, or the East Village, villagepreservation.org/awards. You can go there. It's a very simple nomination form, and we're trying to get a very broad slate of nominees as possible. So find those things. You can also scan the QR code to find out more about becoming a member or donating to Village Preservation. And that's how we continue to have these free events and are able to bring wonderful folks like Glenna here to speak with us. And so with that, I'm getting thank yous in the chat. So it sounds like our time is up, but thank you so much for joining us, Glenna. And I just can't wait to hear more about this. And I'm inspired to do a Jane Jacobs 101 on activism course or something based on her book. Maybe we can talk about sharing her life lessons with us. So thank you so much. Anything else you'd like to say before we go?
I just want to express my gratitude to Village Preservation over the years and for this event. So thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure. Well,
thank you for sharing your research and your great work. And we have lots of thanks coming through the chat. So there's great appreciation for all that you've done. Thank you so much and have a great evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.